listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview retired NYPD detective and author Vic Ferrari. Vic has written 4 books about the inner workings of the New York City Police Department, plus 2 other books, Dickheads and Debauchery, and Confessions of a Catholic High School Graduate. I'm here with Vic Ferrari, who is a retired NYPD detective and the author of, if I'm not mistaken, 6 books. Vic, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Hey, buddy. Thank you so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it.
Now, feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. My name is Vic Ferrari. I'm a retired 20-year member of the New York City Police Department, born and raised in the Bronx, New York City kid. Always wanted to become a police officer. By the age of 21, I went into the police academy, where I had a wonderful 20-year career with the New York City Police Department. I worked on a lot of different units, plainclothes mostly, narcotics, and my last 10, I was a detective in the NYPD's Auto Crime Division, where anything with chop shops, exporting stolen vehicles out of the country, a lot of mafia cases, etc. When I retired from the NYPD about 15 years ago, I got into writing. I've written a series of books, 4 of which are a behind-the-scenes look at the New York City Police Department.
Now, as you mentioned just a few seconds ago, you've written 4 books about the inner workings of the NYPD. And without spoiling too much of those books, what are each of those books about?
Well, my books provide a behind-the-scenes look. So my first NYPD book was NYPD Through the Looking Glass, Stories from Inside America's Largest Police Department. That goes into detail what it's like to come through the police academy, what it's like to be a rookie cop in the Bronx. And there's a lot of interesting stories and colorful characters about what goes on inside a precinct, how a precinct works, the mascots or the people that hang around the precinct, practical jokes that cops play on each other. There's a glossary in the back of the book that's about 5 pages long with just expressions you've never heard of on television. My next book was the NYPD's Flying Circus, Cops, Crime, and Chaos. That's about a lot of the wild and off things that happened off duty with cops, and there's a chapter in there called Crossing Over to the Dark Side, which goes into detail about police corruption and how the NYPD handles it. Then I wrote a book, Grand Theft Auto, the NYPD's Auto Crime Division, which is everything you wanted to know about the stolen car industry, and about my 10 years working in the Auto Crime Division, a car thief's mindset. What happens to your car after it gets stolen? And a lot of cases that I worked on, breaking international car theft rings and just, vehicle theft rings. And then my last NYPD book is NYPD Law and Disorder. That's a lot of things that went wrong, embarrassing moments and things that have happened to me along my path with the NYPD.
Now, you've written a couple of other books. I had these down on my list of questions as 2 separate questions, but I'm going to ask them as a single question. You've written books titled Confessions of a Catholic High School Graduate and another book titled Dickheads and Debauchery. Without spoiling too much about both of those books, what are those about?
Well, Dickheads and Debauchery and Other Ingenious Ways to Die is the ridiculous things that people do to shorten their life expectancy, like going to Spain to run with the Bulls, or not going to see a doctor for decades, and then all of a sudden something goes wrong. It's just an introspective look of the ridiculous things people do to shorten their life expectancy. And then my latest book, Confessions of a Catholic High School Graduate, goes into detail about what it was like growing up in the Bronx in the 70s and 80s. And I was a public school kid up to about 8th grade, and one day we're sitting around the dinner table and my father tells me, "Hey, next year, pick a Catholic high school." I'm like, "Why? We don't even go to Mass." He goes, "Because you're a clown, and if you go to public high school, you're going to be a bigger clown, so pick a school run by the Catholic Church." And it just goes into my experiences with the Catholic Church and what it was like to go to an all-boys Catholic high school. There's a lot of wild stories. I mean, I didn't want to go. I went kicking and screaming, but ultimately, Catholic high school and the New York City Police Department were probably the 2 greatest things that ever happened to me.
Yeah, and the fact that I'm interviewing you about a book about Catholic high schools is quite relevant to where the the area of Illinois where I live, Vermilion County, Illinois, which is in the east central part of the state. Now I was a public school kid. I graduated from a public high school, but the only Catholic high school in my home county, which is Schlarman Academy in Danville, Illinois, a week or two ago, they had a student walkout over a change in administration there, and a former principal getting escorted out by the police.
Interesting. Why
Yeah,
was he
I had
escorted out by the
never
police?
heard of that in my life.
Was he under arrest or escorted out?
He was escorted out, but I don't think he was actually arrested, but I think he was escorted out of police under threat of arrest if he didn't leave.
Do you know the facts and circumstances of why
It's
that
kind of murky, but apparently there was a change in administration, and the principal who was ousted was very popular with the students that went to this Catholic high school, and he was escorted out by police, and the students walked out in protest.
Yeah, that wouldn't have flown in my day. And that's funny because in my 4 years of Catholic high school, we had two to three changes in administration. And the last guy that came in for my, I guess, the tail end of junior year into senior year was not liked. And, there was some pushback by the students, but ultimately, and back then, we're talking, the early 80s, they weren't about to let the inmates run the asylum. When I went to Catholic high school in my time, you had to take it was like the NFL draft. You had to take an entrance exam, and based on your score, you would get letters from different Catholic high schools around the city inviting you for a meet and greet. And, you would go with your parents or guardian and spend the day there and look around. And they would, it was an interview. And they didn't have to take you. Back then, New York City, you had a lot of Catholic families there, and a lot of money was pouring into the Catholic Church. So they didn't have to just take anyone. And it was almost like getting hired by the New York City Police Department. Like, they screened you.
Now I'm gonna move on to some other questions here. Now, are all of the books you've written self-published, or all of them traditionally published, or some self-published and others traditionally published?
No, I didn't have the patience to send out my manuscript to major publishing houses and then wait and to get an offer. And then, with anything else, once they pay you, there's strings attached. They might want you to change something or write a different genre. So I said, you know what, I'm going to go the self-published route, and I'm glad I did.
Now, having looked at the Amazon listings for your books, I really love how the book covers are designed. Who designed the covers for your books?
There's a great company in Canada called ebook.launch.com. They're an a la carte service. So if you wanted to self-publish a book, right, and you Google self-publishing, you're going to get all these companies that pop up. And they all offer different things, but ultimately you pay them up front, $5,000, $10,000, $3,000, whatever it is, and they promise you the moon. And what the ebook launch does is it's more of an a la carte service. So I use them for a lot of things, but specifically my book covers, because for $500 you get a wonderful paperback and ebook cover.
Yeah, and an a la carte service services firm like the one you use can be quite convenient for someone who's self-publishing and might only need one type of editing service or a book cover design service, and doesn't really need a whole package of editing, publishing, and marketing services.
Yeah, exactly. So the first thing I do, once I have a title and I have an idea of what I want my book cover to look like, I contact the company and I fill out a questionnaire, give them the title. They want to know what the book is about. They might want me to send like a book blurb, just to give them an idea. And so, for argument's sake, with my book Grand Theft Auto, the NYPD's Auto Crime Division, I told them, I says, listen, my cover, I want to have a car that's being stripped by two guys in front of an abandoned building, and they're stacking the parts off to the side. And if you can see it, I mean, it just came out wonderful. I've never had a problem with this company. And what people don't realize is, especially self-published authors, is people do judge a book by its cover. It's like buying a bottle of wine when you go into the store and you really don't know what you want. And you say, oh, wow, the price is right, and that's a really cool cover or a catchy name. I'm going to give that a shot. And what people do a lot of times is they skimp on that cover, and it comes back to hurt them in the long run.
Now, if you have a typical writing routine, what is that like for you?
I don't. I write several times a day. I feel that my mind works differently at different parts of the day. I definitely think I'm more analytical first thing in the morning while I'm having a cup of coffee. I try to do editing first thing in the morning. And then if I get some free time in the afternoon, I'll try to write and flesh out stories. And then the evening, I think that's where I'm most creative, where I'll start writing out a story or building one.
Now, what was the biggest challenge you faced going from a career in law enforcement to writing books?
I think every writer goes through this, especially if you're not trained. I mean, I didn't take creative writing or a journalism class, so here I am looking at my keyboard, and I quickly realized I wasn't talented enough or had the skill to write in chronological order. And I think a lot of people, they know what they know what their book, the theme or the genre is about their book, but the opening sometimes is where people struggle, or the first chapter. So my advice, and what I quickly figured out was, I'll pick a story that I know is going to be the focal point in my book, or something that I know is going to be enjoyable to write because I experienced it, right, and I know it forward and backward, and I'll go with that. And then when I get writer's block on that story eventually, I'll take a step back and write another story. And then at the very end of the book, I try to tie everything together.
Now, I understand that I'm going to talk about a subject that is very sensitive to the NYPD in particular, and that is 9/11, which was the darkest day in post-World War II American history. Were you sent to Ground Zero during 9/11, and if so, what were some of your experiences there on that day?
Oh, I was there quite a bit. The first day, actually, on 9/11, I was down there with a bunch of people from my office walking around on the ground by 1:30 in the afternoon. It was terrible. I mean, everything was covered in that toxic dust. The sunlight, it was like twilight in the middle of the day because the sunlight couldn't really get through the particles. We knew that there were health risks there, and they were just, all they had at the time were those little paper masks that you would get at Home Depot if you were going to demo your bathroom. So I was down there the first day from about 1:30 in the afternoon till about 5:30 in the morning. And when we got dismissed, they said, well, go home, take a shower, run your clothes through a washing machine, and be back here tomorrow by 5:30. So the first week or so, I was down there just was setting up a perimeter and helping different police departments with cadaver dogs, and helping construction workers that were bringing in heavy equipment. And then they pulled us back. And within a couple of weeks, then I was back. We were doing the bucket brigade, where I like to call it, we were like ants on a sugar pile of just a line of people passing joint compound buckets filled with debris down the line where it would get sorted. And then later on, since I was a detective in the auto crime division, they brought my team out to the dump out in Staten Island, where after they brought in the heavy equipment, they were bringing out large pieces of debris and a lot of vehicles, destroyed fire trucks, police cars, ambulances, people's personal vehicles. So we were at the dump with different devices like the Jaws of Life, and opening up these vehicles to make sure no one had perished in the car.
And one last question I have are, what are some of the more interesting arrests you've made during your career in law enforcement?
The biggest case I worked on was an international car theft ring where we had Asian nationals in Brooklyn had rented a warehouse, and they had a Jamaican middleman who they were paying $5,000 a car, and the Jamaican middleman was paying his car thieves between $500 to $1,000 per vehicle, and they were stealing 25 to 30 Audi A6s a month. The cars would be parked on the street to cool off, to make sure they didn't have low jack or GPS. They would go out to this warehouse in Brooklyn. They would go in. Once inside the warehouse, they were placed in shipping containers. So they would drive 2 cars in a shipping container, let the air out of the tires so the vehicle sat low in the container. Then they would build a frame above it, a wooden frame, and then they would hoist up another 1 or 2 cars. So each shipping container contained between 3 and 4 stolen Audis. Then they had the containers trucked to Newark, New Jersey. From there, they were put on trains and railed across the United States to Long Beach, California, where they were put on ships to the Pacific Rim. And what we quickly realized during, on listening to wiretaps, was our thieves were in the murder for hire business. And they were talking about killing this guy and whacking that guy. So when we ultimately took the case down, in addition to locking up this international car theft ring, we were able to solve between 13 and 15 homicides.
Wow, I mean, that was more than just a car theft ring. That was full-on organized crime.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah, well, Vic, you are an interesting guest for this podcast, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Oh, Aaron, the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Vic was a very interesting guest to interview, and all 6 of his books are available in ebook format for free for Kindle Unlimited subscribers. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.